Welcome to our next session in studying Greek, the Greek of the New Testament. And we're going to pick up from where we left off on the last video. And you may remember that in the last video, we actually looked at the nominative and the accusative. We looked at a very simple English sentence, the subject and the object of the sentence, and we saw how that translated into these Greek ideas of cases. The nominative case, which is basically the object, the subject, and the accusative case, which is basically the object. Now we need to progress this, and in order to do that I need to do a little bit more English grammar and to look at other ways in which nouns are used. We're really looking at nouns. So how else are nouns used? So to help us, I'm going to take this very simple sentence. I'm throwing the ball to the dog. Now obviously we are doing simple stuff, and although you can create a situation in your mind where you might say that, some of these sentences are a little bit artificial. But they're valid sentences. And the point is that the grammar in the sentences is valid as well. So I'm throwing the ball to the dog. Now, I am the subject of that sentence. I am, and am is the verb. So I am throwing, I'm throwing, so to throw, but I'm throwing the ball is the object of the sentence. So there you have the nominative and the accusative in Greek terms. But you've got this additional little phrase, to the dog. So where does the dog fit in this? Is the dog subject or object? Well, and the answer is it is obviously a kind of object. It's being affected by the throwing. But it's not the thing that I throw. It's a kind of indirectly affected. And so, unsurprisingly, it's known as the indirect object. I'm throwing the ball to the dog. I am the subject. The ball is the object. The dog is the indirect object. And notice also that we've got one other little element in this sentence we haven't come across before, which is the word to. And to is a preposition. We're going to be thinking a little bit more about those before very long, but not at the moment. So there is our basic sentence, and there is the extra little bit that we're going to be thinking about. To the dog, an indirect object. We've said I'm throwing the ball to the dog, but there are some sentences where you don't need that preposition to. Think of this sentence. He gave the news to the king, just like the previous sentence. He is the subject, the news is the object, and so the king is the indirect object. It's not the thing he gave. What he gave is the news, but he gave it to the king. But obviously you turn those words around and you can have he gave the king the news. So is the king the direct object or not? I've certainly seen some grammars that will talk about this as ditransitive, and that means that it can have two direct objects. Let me give you an example of I teach children science. What do you teach, children or science? Well, you teach both. But in this case, the case of the king, it seems to me that the two is still implied. It's still there. So the king is still the indirect object, even without the preposition. And that's quite important, because we're going to see that in Greek, we structure this without the preposition, but we use changes in the structure of the noun. So I'm going to introduce you to the dative case in Greek. We're taking now a biblical example. In fact, this is the example that Duff provides in the little bit at the beginning of the chapter. There's a little grade area where he gives you the example before he really gets started. Jesus spoke to the crowds, and if you want to look at the book, you can actually see that he's got that sentence, and that he gives the Greek for it. Ο Ιησούς ελαλέσαν τους ochlois. Now, don't worry too much about the verb. It doesn't look like anything that we've looked at. And in fact, ho Jesus, you might be able to guess that if you kind of work through the letters. But again, it's not what we've looked at. So don't worry about the bit of the sentence that isn't bold. But it's to the crowds. Now, there's no direct object here. Jesus spoke. Jesus is the subject. Spoke is the verb. But this is a strange one. We didn't really talk about it in English, but you can get this in English as well, as we've got here. You could say Jesus spoke words to the crowds. In fact, I think that's what I've put later. Jesus spoke words to the crowds. You're less likely to see that than the first sentence. But it just explains how you can have Jesus spoke to the crowds with an indirect object, but without a direct object. If you like, the direct object is implied. You in the first sentence, we're not told what he spoke, the direct object, but we are told that he spoke to the crowds, the indirect object. And so the indirect object is in a different case, and it's spelt differently from the two cases we've seen. It's clearly different from both the nominative and the accusative. Just to finish things off, Jesus spoke words to the crowds, and there you've got it. Ho Jesus, which is in fact nominative, although it doesn't look like anything we know. Tous logus does look like something we've talked about before. It's in, I think we used kurios and we had kurious, but it's the same idea. Tous logus, tois ochlois, to the crowds. So there you've got the dative expressing this idea of the indirect object. Now there's a fourth case that we meet in Greek, and in order to understand that, we look at a fourth use of nouns in English. So these cases kind of exist in English. Think of the phrase the king's wives. Now that's the same thing as the wives of the kings, of the king. The king's wives, this little apostrophe S, which in fact an awful lot of people discuss and get confused over. But it's interesting, the noun is the king. And if the king is the subject of the sentence, the king wants to do something, then it's the king. If it's the subject, the object of the sentence, I serve the king, it's still the king. And in fact, if it's the indirect object, I gave the letter to the king doesn't change. In English, the king doesn't change. It changes when it's plural, it becomes kings, but it doesn't change generally. But interestingly enough, it does change here, as is this s, the king's, or z, the king's wives. And it's the leftover in English of the old case structure that actually Old English used to have. And in fact, it's the same sound even when it's kings rather than king. That's the noun in question. So you can also have the king's wives, which means the wives of the kings. But notice that we actually mark the difference by where we put the apostrophe. But actually the sound is exactly the same, which is very confusing. So we have a kind of genitive in English, and in Greek it's known as the genitive case. So it's the of case. So the angel of God, God's angel, the angel is the word that we're looking at. It might be a subject or object, not clear, this is just a phrase, but the of God makes it genitive. And so if we look at the Greek, I've made it the nominative, so I've made it the subject here. Ho angelos toutheu. The toutheu is again different from anything we've seen, including the dative. It's the genitive form, the of form. And so we come to the example that Duff gives, the sound of a crowd. I've changed that as well. I've put it with the genitive, with the English change, a crowd's noise. I'm hoping that that might help trigger the fact that by changing the noun a little bit in English, you get this of sense. And so it's not surprising that you change it a little bit in the Greek as well. And you get phonen, ochlu. Now don't worry again about phonen, not quite what we've before, but it's the ochlu, of the crowd. So already we're encountering words as they're used in the Bible, and you'll see the Bible references that Duff is using in that grey area in the book. But it helps us to see how the Greek has these two additional structures within the noun structure as a whole, which allows it to determine whether it's the subject, the object, the direct object, or this of usage, the genitive. And so here are the examples that we've looked at. The genitive, so this is the word, we're using logos, the word. So of the word, logu, of the words, logon, to the word, logo, with this little iota underneath, but you can't hear it, and to the words, logois. And so, in fact, the full dative structure, the full noun structure is here. And that's what Duff is asking you to learn. That's what you need to learn. You'll see I've given the title here, the full second declension masculine. Now we're going to look a little bit more about this masculine. It's the gender. And like a lot of European languages, modern languages, Greek does have different genders, which makes things a little bit more complicated for us. We're not used to that. So here this noun is masculine. It's marked, if you like, in the nominative singular, which is how we normally represent it in the dictionary form. So as logos, it's marked by the os at the end. So it's logos. And if it's a normal os ending noun like this second declension, it will follow this form as we've presented it. So you need to learn that form. Read through Duff's section, follow the form, learn the form, and do the exercises that he's given so that you can get familiar with this idea. And if it's strange to you, if you've done some Latin or indeed German, this will be pretty straightforward stuff. But if you haven't, it may take a little getting used to. But hopefully I've given you a kind of context which will allow you to get your head around it fairly easily. Now notice I've added one extra thing here. There is actually a fifth case, which is the vocative. And I always put them in this order. Some books have them in a slightly different order. I think Duff has this order as well. But you'll often see the vocative missed out because it's not used very often. And in most cases where it is used, it actually follows the nominative. So usually it's exactly the same as the nominative. It just happens that in the second declension, it is actually slightly different. So you've got this extra one, logger. And this is the one where you call. So really, it won't even exist for logos, really, because you're not going to say a word, which is what vocative actually means, or word, do this. It's usually people. It might be used occasionally in a role. So, slave, do this. And then you would have doule rather than doulos. But it really doesn't happen very often at all. So don't worry quite so much about the vocative as some of the others. But those are the fifth cases. That is the complete declension now, including the vocative. So there we are. I hope you have enjoyed it, and I hope you get to grips with that little section.